Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. I'd like to thank Shaban 1000 for joining the Curator's Disciples. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Your viewership is very much appreciated. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's Disciples. The link is in the description below. Today's narration is a single long-form story. I have had requests for a psychological thriller. Consider your request fulfilled. Story number 1, Voices in the Dark, by the Curator. I guess I should start from the beginning, or at least as far back as I can remember. My name is Jason Parker, and I've been living with this thing, this disorder, since I was a kid, though I didn't understand it back then. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. My childhood wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. My parents split up when I was 5, and I spent most of my time bouncing between my mom's tiny apartment and my dad's rundown house. My mom was always working, trying to keep a roof over our heads, so I was alone a lot. I guess that's when the voices first started. At the time, I thought it was just my imagination. I'd hear someone whispering in my ear, telling me things, warning me about dangers that weren't there. Sometimes, the voices were comforting, like an invisible friend who was always with me when I was scared. Other times, they were darker, more demanding, telling me to do things I didn't want to do. I didn't talk about it with anyone because I didn't want them to think I was crazy. So, I kept it to myself, thinking that maybe everyone had these voices and just didn't talk about them. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I realized something was really wrong. The voices started getting louder, more insistent. I'd lose chunks of time, waking up in places I didn't remember going to, with no idea how I got there. School was tough. I was the weird kid, the one who didn't have many friends. I tried to fit in, but the more I tried, the worse it got. The voices would argue with each other, sometimes in the middle of class, making it impossible to concentrate. I started getting into fights, lashing out at kids who would tease me or push me around. I didn't want to, but it was like I couldn't control it. My dad wasn't much help. He'd tell me to man up and stop acting like a freak. He had his own issues, drinking too much, and taking his anger out on me when things didn't go his way. My mom was more understanding, but she was always so busy, and I didn't want to worry her more than I already did. So, I kept everything bottled up, hoping that maybe it would just go away on its own. It didn't. By the time I was 16, the voices had names. Eli was the first one I recognized. He was kind and gentle, always trying to keep me calm when things got too much. He felt like an older brother, someone who wanted to protect me from the world. But then there was Max. Max was the opposite. He was dark, angry, and cruel. He thrived on chaos and fear, pushing me to do things I didn't want to do. He'd tell me to hurt people, to make them pay for all the pain they caused me. I tried to resist, but it wasn't easy. Victor came later. He wasn't like Eli or Max. He was cold, logical, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He didn't care about right or wrong, just about what needed to be done to survive. And then there was Sophie. Sophie was different from the others. She was scared, always hiding away when things got bad. She didn't talk much, but I could feel her fear, her sadness. She was like a little sister, someone I wanted to protect, even though I didn't know how. By the time I graduated high school, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I was barely holding it together, and I was scared of what I might do if things got worse. So, I moved away, trying to start fresh in a new city. I thought maybe I could outrun the voices, leave them behind with my old life. But they followed me, growing louder and more powerful the more I tried to ignore them. That's when I met Dr. Emily Carter. I was 23, working a dead-end job at a grocery store, just trying to make ends meet. I had a breakdown one day at work, screaming at a customer for no reason, and that's when I knew I needed help. I started seeing Dr. Carter once a week, and for the first time, I felt like someone actually understood what I was going through. She didn't judge me, didn't look at me like I was crazy. She listened, really listened, and she helped me understand what was happening in my head. But therapy wasn't a magic fix. The voices were still there, and as much as Dr. Carter tried to help, Max was always lurking, waiting for a chance to take over. He hated her, saw her as a threat to his control. Eli tried to keep him in check, but Max was strong, stronger than I realized. And then, one day, everything changed. I found this forum on the dark web, a place where people shared their darkest thoughts, their most violent fantasies. I knew I shouldn't have gone there, but I was curious. Max was thrilled. He fed off the posts, growing stronger with every word he read. And the more he read, the more he pushed me to act on the things he saw. I tried to resist, but it was like I was losing a battle I didn't even know I was fighting. The days after I discovered that dark web forum felt like a blur, like I was sinking deeper into a pit with no way out. I couldn't stay away from it. Every night after work, I'd sit in front of my computer. The screens glowed, the only light in my tiny apartment. It became a ritual, one I didn't even realize I was creating. I'd lock the door, close the curtains, and log on. The things I read there were horrifying. People discussing their most twisted thoughts, their darkest desires. But for some reason, I couldn't look away. Max loved it. I could feel him growing stronger every time I scrolled through another post. He'd whisper in my ear, telling me to try this, to do that, to stop being a coward. I could almost see him, grinning like a devil, reveling in the chaos. Eli tried to fight back, to remind me of who I really was. But his voice was growing weaker by the day. The more time I spent on that forum, the more control Max had over me. It wasn't just Max, though. Victor started to speak up more often too, his voice cold and calculating. He didn't care about the twisted fantasies like Max did, but he saw potential in them. He saw a way to gain control over my life, to stop being the victim and start being the one in charge. Victor's logic was terrifying because it made sense in a way that scared me. He wasn't driven by emotion or desire, just a need to protect us all, no matter the cost. And then there was Sophie. She was different from the others, quieter, more fragile. She hated the forum, hated the things Max and Victor were saying. I could feel her trembling whenever I logged on, like she was trying to hide from the darkness closing in around us. Sometimes she would cry, begging me to stop, but her voice was so faint, so easily drowned out by the others. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but I couldn't even convince myself of that anymore. Dr. Carter noticed the change in me almost immediately. She started asking more questions in our sessions, probing deeper into my thoughts. I tried to keep the forum a secret, but I could tell she knew something was wrong. She started talking more about the importance of resisting harmful urges, of finding healthy outlets for my anger and frustration. But Max didn't like that. He saw her as a threat, someone trying to take away the one thing that made him feel alive. Victor agreed with Max, though for different reasons. He saw Dr. Carter as someone who could expose us, someone who could make us vulnerable. He started suggesting ways to protect ourselves, ways to neutralize the threat she posed. I tried to ignore them, to focus on Eli's calming words, but the darkness was closing in, and I was losing the battle. One night, after another long session on the forum, Max pushed me further than he ever had before. He wanted action, not just words. He wanted to feel the power, the control. He started suggesting things, little things at first, like following someone home or leaving a threatening note. But then the suggestions became darker, more dangerous. He wanted blood, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. I tried to resist, but Max was relentless. He'd whisper in my ear all day, at work, at home, even in my sleep. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, his voice echoing in my head, telling me what I needed to do. I started to feel like I was going insane, like I was losing myself completely. But it wasn't insanity, it was Max. He was taking over, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. Then came the night that changed everything. I don't know what triggered it, but something snapped inside me. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at the computer screen, when Max started screaming at me. He was tired of waiting, tired of my hesitation. He wanted action, and he wanted it now. I tried to shut him out, to focus on something else, but his voice was too loud, too overpowering. And then, before I knew it, I was standing outside Dr. Carter's house. I don't remember driving there, don't remember getting out of my car. It was like I was on autopilot, my body moving without my mind's consent. Max was in control, and I was just along for the ride. I remember looking up at her house, seeing the lights on inside, and feeling a sick sense of satisfaction that wasn't mine. Victor was there too, whispering in the background, telling me what to do, how to do it. His voice was cold and calm, guiding me through the steps like it was a military operation. Eli was screaming, begging me to stop, to turn around and go home. But his voice was so weak, so far away. Max and Victor drowned him out, their voices merging into one twisted chorus that pushed me forward. I remember creeping around the side of the house, my heart pounding in my chest, but not from fear. No, it was excitement, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I reached the back door. It was unlocked. I remember thinking how careless that was, how stupid she was for not locking it. Victor agreed, calling her a fool, an easy target. Max just laughed, thrilled by how easy this was going to be. The house was quiet as I stepped inside. The only sound my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to dance around me as I moved. I remember the smell of her house, clean, like lavender and lemon. It felt wrong, out of place, like I was stepping into a dream. But this wasn't a dream, it was real, and Max was in control. I made my way through the house, careful to avoid the creaky floorboards Victor pointed out. I knew where she would be, in her study, where she always stayed late at night, working on her notes. I don't know how long I stood outside the door, listening to her hum softly to herself, unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. And then I opened the door. She looked up, surprised, but not scared at first. She probably thought I was there for a late-night emergency session. But then she saw the look in my eyes, saw the way I was standing, and her expression changed. Fear, pure, unadulterated fear. It was like a switch flipped inside her, and she knew. She knew something was very, very wrong. I don't remember much of what happened next. It's all a blur. Her scream, the struggle, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, and then silence. Complete and utter silence, except for Max's laughter echoing in my head. When I came to, I was back in my car, parked outside my apartment. My hands were shaking, covered in something dark and sticky. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what I had done. But I knew, deep down, I knew exactly what had happened. The days after that night were a haze of confusion, guilt, and fear. I didn't go back to the dark web forum. I didn't do much of anything. I was too scared, too ashamed of what I had become. I knew something terrible had happened, but I couldn't remember all the details. Max was silent, but I could feel him there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I stayed in my apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that night. Dr. Carter's terrified face, the struggle, the darkness that followed. I could hear Eli whispering, trying to comfort me, telling me that it wasn't my fault, that it was Max. But it didn't help. I was too far gone, too lost in the darkness. Victor was still there, cold and calculating as ever. He didn't feel guilt or remorse. He only cared about survival. He started planning, thinking of ways to cover our tracks, to make sure no one would ever find out what had happened. He was methodical, emotionless, and terrifyingly efficient. But even he couldn't suppress the fear that was growing inside me. Sophie was the worst. She wouldn't stop crying, wouldn't stop pleading for someone to make it all go away. Her fear was overwhelming, suffocating. It was like she was drowning, and I couldn't save her. Every time she spoke, it was like a knife twisting in my gut, reminding me of the horror I had unleashed. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. What would I say? That I had voices in my head that made me do it. They'd lock me up for sure, and maybe that's what I deserved. But I couldn't do it. I was too scared, too confused, and too controlled by the voices in my head. Max remained silent, and that scared me more than anything. I knew he was there, waiting, watching, ready to take control the moment I let my guard down. Eli was trying his best to hold everything together, but he was losing strength. He couldn't fight Max alone, and I was too broken to help. I spent hours sitting on the floor of my apartment, staring at the knife I didn't remember bringing back with me. It was clean now, but I knew what it had done. I knew the blood it had spilled. I knew the lives it had ruined, mine included. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it, though. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in on me. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hide some reminder of what I had done, what Max had driven me to do. I was trapped in my own mind, haunted by the fragments of that night. The pieces that didn't quite fit together but painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. Days turned into weeks, and I became a recluse, avoiding the outside world as much as possible. My work started to suffer. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on anything other than the overwhelming guilt that was eating me alive. My coworkers noticed, of course. They asked if I was okay, if I needed help, but I brushed them off with mumbled excuses about stress and lack of sleep. They didn't push, but I could see the concern in their eyes. Eli tried to keep me grounded, tried to remind me of the good things in my life, but his voice was so faint, like a whisper carried away by the wind. Sophie's cries were louder, more persistent, filling my head with a constant stream of fear and self-loathing. Victor, cold and pragmatic as ever, urged me to move on, to forget about Dr. Carter and focus on survival. He was convinced that as long as we kept our heads down, we'd be fine. But I couldn't forget. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face twisted in terror. I could still hear her screams, still feel the weight of what I had done pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I didn't want to move on. I didn't deserve to. Max's silence was the worst part. I knew he was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to take control again. The longer he stayed quiet, the more anxious I became. I started to feel like I was being watched, like someone or something was always just out of sight, ready to strike the moment I let my guard down. Paranoia took root, growing stronger with each passing day. I began to see things out of the corner of my eye. Flashes of movement, dark figures that disappeared as soon as I turned to look. I started hearing things too. Footsteps in the hall, whispers in the dead of night. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a symptom of the guilt and fear that was consuming me. But the more it happened, the more real it felt. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that someone was in the apartment with me. I could hear breathing, low, raspy, coming from somewhere in the darkness. I grabbed the knife from under my pillow, my hands shaking as I crept through the apartment, searching for the intruder. But there was no one there, just shadows and silence. I didn't sleep much after that. The fear was too strong, the sense of impending doom too overwhelming. I started drinking to take the edge off, to dull the voices in my head and the memories that haunted me. But it didn't help. It only made things worse. The more I drank, the more I lost control. Max started to stir again, his voice growing louder, more insistent. He fed off my fear, my anger, pushing me to the brink of madness. He told me that Dr. Carter had deserved what happened to her, that she had been a threat, a danger to us all. He said that I had done the right thing, that I was stronger now because of it. But I didn't feel strong. I felt weak, broken, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I didn't know who I was anymore. Didn't know if I was even in control of my own actions. The line between reality and the dark world in my mind was blurring, and I was terrified of what would happen if it disappeared altogether. Then came the nightmares. They were vivid, more real than any dream I'd ever had. I would find myself back in Dr. Carter's house, standing over her lifeless body, the knife in my hand dripping with blood. But it wasn't just her. The faces of other people I knew, people I cared about, started appearing in the nightmares. My coworkers, my neighbors, even strangers I passed on the street. Each time, I would wake up drenched in sweat, the taste of bile in my mouth, my heart pounding with fear and disgust. I couldn't take it anymore. I was unraveling, falling apart piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. The guilt, the fear, the voices, they were all too much. I started to think about ending it all, about finding a way to make the pain stop, to silence the voices once and for all. But even in that, I was too much of a coward. Max taunted me, calling me weak, daring me to go through with it, while Sophie pleaded with me to hold on, to find another way. But there was no other way. At least, that's what I thought until I found the letter. It was a rainy afternoon when it arrived. I had been sitting in the dark, nursing a half-empty bottle of whiskey, when I heard the mail slot clatter. I almost didn't get up to check. It had been weeks since I'd cared about the outside world. But something compelled me to move, to shuffle to the door and pick up the small, unmarked envelope lying on the floor. There was no return address, no stamp, nothing to indicate where it had come from. Just my name, scrawled in shaky handwriting across the front. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, a sense of dread creeping over me. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to know what was inside. But curiosity, or maybe something else, pushed me to tear it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling as I read the words written in the same shaky handwriting. I know what you did. That was all it said. Just 5 words, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the room start to spin. Someone knew about Dr. Carter, about that night. My mind raced, trying to figure out who could have sent it. Was it a neighbor? A coworker? Had someone followed me that night? Max was screaming at me now, his voice loud and angry, telling me to get rid of the letter, to burn it, destroy any evidence. Victor was more composed, urging me to stay calm, to think rationally. He said we needed to figure out who sent it, to assess the threat and neutralize it before it got out of hand. But I couldn't think. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and paranoia. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I rushed to the window, peering through the blinds, but all I saw was the rain-soaked street, empty and quiet. Panic set in. What if they went to the police? What if they told someone what they knew? I couldn't go to prison. I couldn't let them lock me away where Max would have full control. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. Then, as if in answer to my unspoken question, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my door. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, every muscle tensing as I listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing louder as they approached. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it the police? The person who sent the letter? Or was it just my imagination, playing tricks on me again? The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and I held my breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity. Then, a soft knock echoed through the apartment, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I stayed frozen, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by a voice, low, calm, and eerily familiar. "Ben," the voice said, and my blood ran cold. It was Dr. Carter's voice. "Ben, I know you're in there. I need to talk to you." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and listen. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink as her voice continued, muffled slightly by the door. "You can't hide from me, Ben," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "You need to face what you've done. It's the only way." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision as I shook my head, trying to block out her words. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Dr. Carter was dead. I had seen her die, had felt the life leave her body. She couldn't be standing outside my door, talking to me like nothing had happened. But the voice persisted, growing more insistent, more demanding. "You can't ignore this forever, Ben. It's time to take responsibility. It's time to do the right thing." I sank to the floor, my back against the door, tears streaming down my face as I tried to block out the sound. But it was no use. Her voice was everywhere, surrounding me, filling my head with guilt and shame. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The voice fell silent, leaving me alone in the darkness, shaking and sobbing uncontrollably. I don't know how long I stayed like that, huddled on the floor, my body racked with sobs. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Time had lost all meaning. When I finally looked up, the room was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the dim street lamp outside my window. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. But there was no sign of Dr. Carter's voice. No hint that she or whoever it had been was still outside my door. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body protesting. My legs were numb, trembling beneath me as I made my way to the bathroom. I needed to wash my face, to clear my head, to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The cold water splashed against my skin, shocking me back to reality. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the person looking back at me. My eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them dark and hollow. My once neat hair was disheveled, and a patchy beard had started to grow on my face. I looked like a stranger, a ghost of the man I used to be. But as I stared into my own eyes, I could still hear her voice echoing in my mind. Those haunting words. It's time to take responsibility. It's time to do the right thing. What did that mean? What was the right thing? I didn't know anymore. My life had spiraled so far out of control that I couldn't even tell up from down. All I knew was that I was trapped in this nightmare, and there was no escape. I stumbled back into the living room, feeling more lost and broken than ever before. The envelope with the letter was still lying on the coffee table, a stark reminder of the message it contained. I wanted to burn it, to erase every trace of it from existence, but something stopped me. A small, nagging voice in the back of my mind. Sophie, maybe, telling me that I needed to keep it, that it was a clue, a piece of the puzzle that I couldn't afford to lose. I picked up the letter again, rereading those 5 words over and over, trying to decipher their meaning. Who could have sent it? And why? What did they want from me? Max was screaming at me again, telling me to destroy it, to cover my tracks, to find whoever was responsible and make sure they never spoke another word. Victor was more composed, urging me to stay calm and think logically, to figure out who could have seen or known what happened that night. But I was too exhausted to listen to either of them. My thoughts were muddled, clouded by fear and paranoia. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. I needed help, but I didn't know who to turn to. I was alone in this, isolated by my own guilt and the walls of my mind. And then, in a moment of clarity, I remembered Dr. Carter's research. She had been studying people like me, people with DID, people who heard voices, who struggled to maintain control. What if she had left something behind, something that could help me understand what was happening to me? Maybe she had notes, recordings, something that could give me the answers I so desperately needed. The thought terrified me. The last place I wanted to go was back to her house, back to the scene of my crime. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If there was anything that could help me, anything that could explain what was happening to me, it would be there. And if there was any chance of finding out who had sent the letter, it would be there too. I grabbed my coat and keys before I could talk myself out of it. The rain had picked up, a steady downpour that soaked through my clothes as soon as I stepped outside. The streets were empty, the city quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The drive to Dr. Carter's house was a blur, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I kept expecting to see police cars in the rearview mirror, to hear sirens wailing in the distance, but there was nothing, just the rain and the darkness and the steady thrum of my heart. When I pulled up to the house, it looked exactly as I remembered it. The lights were off, the windows dark, the front door locked. I hesitated for a moment, the fear and guilt crashing over me like a tidal wave, threatening to pull me under. But I forced myself to move, to keep going. I couldn't turn back now. The key was still in its hiding place, under the mat, just as I had left it. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house hitting me like a punch to the gut. The memories of that night came flooding back. The fear, the desperation, the blood. I nearly turned and ran, but I knew I had to see this through. I had to find out what she knew, what she had been hiding. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. I made my way to her study, the place where I'd found her that night, where everything had gone so horribly wrong. The room was just as I remembered it. Bookshelves lining the walls, a desk cluttered with papers, the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the air. I started searching through her papers, rifling through the stacks of notes and files, looking for anything that might give me a clue. But it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. There were so many documents, so much information, and I had no idea what I was looking for. Then, buried under a stack of books, I found it, a small, leather-bound journal. It was old, the pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. My heart raced as I opened it, flipping through the pages, my eyes scanning the words for any mention of me, of what had happened. The journal was filled with her notes, her observations on patients with DID, on the different personalities she had encountered, the treatments she had tried. But as I read on, something caught my eye. A name, scrawled in the margins, circled multiple times, Benjamin. My breath caught in my throat. She had been writing about me. She had known all along. The entry was dated a few weeks before her death. She had written about our sessions, about the progress, or lack thereof, that I had been making. She mentioned the different personalities she had encountered. Sophie, Victor, Max, and her concerns about the growing influence Max had over me. But it was the last few lines that made my blood run cold. Benjamin is losing control. Max is growing stronger, more dominant. I fear that if something isn't done soon, he may become dangerous. Not only to himself, but to others. I need to confront him, to make him see what's happening before it's too late. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. She had known. She had known that Max was taking over, that I was becoming a danger, and she had planned to confront me, to stop me, but she hadn't. Because I had stopped her first. The weight of what I had done hit me like a sledgehammer. I had killed her to protect myself, to keep Max from taking over completely. But in doing so, I had unleashed him, given him the control he so desperately craved. And now there was no one left to stop him. My hands shook as I closed the journal, my mind racing. What had I done? What was I going to do? And then I saw it, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the shadows dancing on the walls. But I knew I wasn't alone. Max was there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for his moment to strike. I could feel him, feel his presence growing stronger, more insistent. He was taking over, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. The letter, the voice, the nightmares. It was all him. He had been playing me, manipulating me, pushing me to the brink of madness. And now he was ready to take control completely, to push me out of my own mind, to claim my body as his own. I had to do something. I had to stop him before it was too late. But how? How could I fight something that was inside me, something that was a part of me? The answer came to me in a moment of clarity, a flash of understanding that cut through the fog of fear and confusion. I couldn't fight him. I couldn't win, but I could take us both down. I grabbed the journal and ran out of the house, my mind made up. There was only one way to end this, only one way to make sure Max never hurt anyone again. As I drove back to my apartment, the rain pounding against the windshield, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was it, the end of the line. I was going to do what Dr. Carter couldn't. I was going to stop Max once and for all. When I got back to the apartment, I went straight to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. I stared at it for a long moment, the weight of what I was about to do sinking in. But there was no other way. I couldn't live like this anymore. I stood in the middle of my apartment, the knife in my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. The cold metal felt foreign, heavy, like the weight of the decision I was about to make. I knew that this was the only way to stop Max, to put an end to the madness that had taken over my life. But as I stared at the blade, doubt crept in. Was this really the solution? Could I really go through with it? Max's voice, ever the manipulator, slithered into my thoughts. You're weak, Benjamin. You always have been. But I'm not. I'm the part of you that's strong enough to survive, to do what needs to be done. You don't want to end this, do you? You don't want to die. I clenched my teeth, trying to block him out, but his words seeped into my mind like poison. He was right, in a way. I didn't want to die. I wanted to live, but I wanted to live without him, without the constant fear, without the guilt that had been eating away at me for so long. But the only way to be free was to end it all. I raised the knife, the point hovering just above my chest. My heart pounded in my ears, a drumbeat of fear and determination. I could feel Max's panic, his desperation as he realized what I was about to do. No, you can't do this, Benjamin. We're the same, you and I. You need me. Without me, you're nothing. His voice grew louder, more frantic, but I knew it was a lie. I didn't need him. I had never needed him. He was the part of me that had been twisted by fear and anger, the part that had taken control when I was too weak to fight back. But now I was taking that control back. With a deep breath, I pushed the knife against my chest, feeling the sharp point dig into my skin. Max screamed in my mind, a high-pitched wail of terror, but I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on the task at hand. I knew this was the only way. I had to end it once and for all. But just as I was about to push the blade deeper, something stopped me. A voice, soft and soothing, cut through the chaos in my mind. Benjamin, please don't do this. It was Sophie. Her voice was calm, gentle, a stark contrast to Max's frantic screams. She was the part of me that had always tried to keep me grounded, the part that had held on to hope even when everything seemed lost. You don't have to do this, she continued. There's another way. We can get help. We can fight this together. But you have to let me in. You have to trust me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I listened to her. She was right. There was another way. I didn't have to end it all. I didn't have to give in to Max's control. I could fight back, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed Sophie. I needed to trust her, to let her help me. With a shaking hand, I lowered the knife, letting it fall to the floor with a clatter. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on me all at once. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Sophie, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Thank you for saving me. We'll get through this, Benjamin, she replied softly. I sat there on the floor for what felt like hours, the silence of the apartment wrapping around me like a blanket. Max's voice had faded into the background, a distant echo of the power he once held over me. Sophie's presence was stronger now, more comforting, and I knew that as long as I had her, I could face whatever came next. But the battle wasn't over. I still had a long road ahead of me. I would need to get help, real help, from professionals who could guide me through the healing process. I would need to confront the guilt, the trauma, and the darkness that had consumed me for so long. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to fight. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I made a decision. I would go to the police. I would tell them everything about Dr. Carter, about the letter, about the voices in my head. I would face the consequences of my actions, whatever they might be. It was the only way to truly move forward, to make amends for the things I had done. I stood up, my legs still shaky, but my resolve stronger than ever. I picked up the knife from the floor and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed the number I'd been dreading to call for so long. When the operator answered, I took a deep breath, my voice steady as I spoke. My name is Benjamin, and I need to report a crime. I killed someone, and I need to turn myself in. As I spoke those words, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally doing the right thing. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges I couldn't yet imagine. But I wasn't alone anymore. Sophie was with me, and together, we would find a way to heal, to make things right. And as the police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life. One where I would finally confront the darkness within and learn to live with it, rather than be consumed by it. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time.